Alright, so we are in Revelation 10:1, Revelation 10:1. And it gets the whole book of Revelation, of course, as you all know, is confusing. There's different series of actions going on, and then there are pauses, and then there are transitions that aren't described. So I'm gonna just go over briefly again. I'm gonna just go over briefly the structure so far, what we've read so far. So chapter 1, it tells us that John was praying on the Lord's Day. And Christ directs him to transcribe what he will hear and see. Chapters 2 and 3, he transcribes the 7 letters to the 7 churches. Chapters 4 and 5, he's taken up into the throne room of God in heaven. And he's surveying what's happening in the throne room. In chapter 6, the action begins when he opens the first 6 seals of the 7 seals. And then the first 4 of those 7 seals are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. Chapter 7, there's an interlude in which John sees the church on earth protected by the seal of God, and the church in heaven triumphant and praising God. Chapter 8, the action resumes, and John records the opening of the 7th seal by the Lamb. With this, the 7 trumpet angels begin to sound at the opening of the 7th seal in chapter 9. Chapter 9, the first 6 trumpet angels sound, each bringing plagues that are reminiscent of Egypt. Alright, that brings us to chapter 10. Now from chapters 4, when John was taken up into the throne room of God, until the end of chapter 9, which we finished last time, John had watched these visions unfold from heaven. He was still in heaven in the throne room. Now at the beginning of chapter 10, it doesn't tell us this, but he's back on earth and viewing things from the perspective on earth. So I think one of the dangers we have to watch out for in reading Revelation is we tend to hear about Revelation as being kind of this chronological sequence of events that is going to happen at the end of time, but that's not how it's structured. It goes back and forth. He sees things from heaven, he sees things from earth, he sees things in the future, he sees things in the past. We're going to get to probably today him seeing the birth of Christ. So obviously he's not just seeing the future, he's going back as well. So it's not just the part of what makes it so confusing is that these things are constantly changing. He's giving us visions, but they're not in any particular order. And he keeps having these series of 7, right? And each time you can kind of think of it as like this spiral. Each time 7 is completed, a new 7 is opened. And it's almost like he's digging deeper and deeper into the more details as we go on, as the spiral continues. So just keep that in mind. It is very confusing. Alright, so chapter 10:1, now he's back down on earth. He says, I saw still another mighty angel coming down from heaven. So that's how we know he's back on earth, because he sees it coming down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was on his head. His face was like the sun, and his feet like pillars of fire. So his feet were like pillars of fire. That reminds us of what? The pillar of fire. God in the Exodus, right? Which Exodus is kind of in the background of this central section of Revelation. So the pillar of fire recalls that God manifested himself as a pillar of fire as he led and protected and guided the children of Israel on their wilderness journey. So this is the pillar of fire is bringing back this imagery. Alright, now this part's interesting. 2, he had a little book open in his hand. So the bibliarium, a little book, and there we got to remember that the book was actually invented by Christians, right? The book or codex was invented by Christians, probably close to the year 300. So at this time there is no such thing as a book as we know it, right? It's a scroll. When they talk about a book, they're talking about a scroll. That becomes important in a second. So he had a little book or scroll open in his hand. It's open this time. Remember earlier he had a scroll that was sealed with the 7 seals. This appears to be a different scroll now, a little one that's open. His foot on the sea and his left foot on the land. Right, so this gives us this image that he's this huge, mighty angel. 1 foot is on the sea, the Mediterranean, we assume, and the left foot on the land. And he cried with a loud voice as when a lion roars. When he cried out, 7 thunders uttered their voices. So then again, another 7. Now when the 7 thunders uttered their voices, I was about to write. So the 7 thunders were thundering some message. And you get the image of him here, like was common for among Greeks and Jews, that he was taking notes, right? Because remember at the beginning, God had told him, write down what you see and hear. So he's all through all these visions, he's taking notes. And he was about to write what the 7 thunders were saying. But I heard a voice from heaven saying to me, seal up the things which the 7 thunders uttered, and do not write them. So he contradicts his first commandment at the beginning in chapter 1. He says, on these particular things from the 7 thunders, don't write this part. So this is kind of typical of apocalyptic literature, we call it. So this is Revelation is also called the apocalypse. Apocalypse means the revealing, revelation. And there are times in other apocalyptic revelatory literature where there are certain parts that are restricted, not set forth. And we can think of St. Paul when in 2 Corinthians when he's taken up into the third heaven, and there are things that is not lawful to be uttered. Right, so there's some things that he saw in his vision of the throne room that he was told that he cannot repeat. Right, so there are some things in these visions that it's common that some things are not to be revealed. So that's what happens here. All right, verse 5. The angel whom I saw standing on the sea and on the land raised up his hand to heaven and swore by him who lives forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that are in it, the earth and the things that are in it, and the sea and the things that are in it, that there should be delay no longer. But in the days of the sounding of the 7th angel, the 7th trumpet angel, when he is about to sound, the mystery of God will be finished, as he declared to his servants the prophets. Alright, so raising his hand, the angel raises his hand to heaven and swears. This is an allusion to Daniel 12:7. When an angel lifted his hands toward heaven and swore by the one who lives forever and ever. That there would only be, in Daniel 12:7, he swore forever and ever that there would only be 3.5 more years until the end. This is Daniel's apocalyptic vision in chapter 12. So here this angel swears that time has come and there is no further delay. So the 3.5 years predicted and swore by the angel in Daniel, now what John is seeing is that an angel is swearing that there will be no further delay. The end is now. No more delay. And he says, in the days of the sounding of the 7th angel, which is about to sound, the mystery of God would be finished as he declared to his servants the prophets. In other words, with this 7th trumpet, this is the end. What John is going to describe now at the 7th trumpet is what's going to happen at the end time. All right. And it also means that the time for humanity to change its course is at its end, right? Because there will be no further delay. In Daniel 12, they warned that there were 3.5 years left until the end. As a way, the prophets were always tasked with calling people to repent, right? So the purpose of the message was the time is short, 3.5 years. Therefore, make use of it, repent, change your ways, come into the will of God. And I should say about 3.5 years. Why 3.5? So 7 is this complete number. So 7 years is a complete, full, whole amount of time. 3.5 signals a finite amount of time, a specific amount of time, not this whole long period of time, but a specific period of time.
There were the 7 trumpets and 7
Yeah.
of everything else.
Because it's complete, it's full. Alright, so this 3.5 is going to keep coming up again and again. Alright, 10:8. Then the voice which I heard from heaven spoke to me again. So not the angel, this mighty tall angel that he sees standing on heaven and earth, but the voice from heaven that told him, don't write the things that the 7 thunders say. This voice from heaven spoke to me again and said, go, take the little book which is open in the hand of the angel, in other words, that little scroll, which is open in the hand of the angel who stands on the sea and on the earth. So I went to the angel and said to him, give me the little book, scroll. And he said to me, the angel, take and eat it, and it will make your stomach bitter, but it will be sweet as honey in your mouth. Then I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it, and it was as sweet as honey in my mouth. But when I had eaten it, my stomach became bitter. And he said to me, you must prophesy again about many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings. Alright, so this imagery is based on Ezekiel 2-3. Ezekiel chapters 2 and 3, where Ezekiel is called to be a prophet. So here John is being called to be a prophet. Up until this point, he's simply reporting visions. Now he's being called and set apart as a prophet, and he's going to be given a certain task to prophesy, not just to the people of Israel, like Ezekiel, but to many peoples, nations, tongues, and kings. Alright, so what happens in Ezekiel 2 and 3? A hand is extended to Ezekiel containing a scroll written on both sides with a message of 3 kinds of judgment. Ezekiel ate the scroll, which it says tasted sweet to his mouth, but was a message of judgment for Israel. So we could say it was bitter in that sense.
How did John know all this stuff? I think Paul wrote it, that he's a Bible scholar. Well, I think John was just a more simple educated person, so did he study, was it really good? Or
I
what did
think-
the fathers say?
You know, I didn't find anything about that, but I would say it was revealed to him. It's not that, I mean, I think we have to assume he was a rabbinic disciple. I mean, he was a disciple of Jesus in particular, so he was a Torah student. So he would have, but probably not to the education level of Paul, but he was not ignorant of the scriptures. So, and Jews in that time would have been probably more familiar with the scriptures than we are. So he would have been familiar with this imagery, but it's not that he's just creating this imagery out of his head from things that he's already read. He's actually seeing this, and God is using images that he's used in the past as consistent in his message, and he's using imagery that John would be able to understand, you know, like the eating of the scroll as because what's the signal, what does it signify, eating the scroll? It signifies that he has to, the scroll is this message of judgment that he has to prophesy to the nations. And he has to internalize that message before he can go and do it, before he can go and preach this to the nations. So he has to kind of metabolize the message, to internalize it. That's why he eats it. Alright. Yeah, and the bitterness, of course, that he feels in his stomach. The sweetness is that it's the word of the Lord, right? The word of the Lord came to him like it comes to the prophets. But the bitterness in his stomach is that, unfortunately, it's judgment that he must proclaim. So
It says in the note in the Orthodox Bible, the bitterness is the stomach shows the sweetness of receiving God's revelation, as opposed to the bitterness of its message.
yeah, the bitterness of the judgment message, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Let's see. So John, Ezekiel's message was for Israel, but John is to prophesy to many nations like Jeremiah. Jeremiah and his call to be a prophet in Jeremiah 1:10 is also called to prophesy to many nations. Alright, so that's chapter 10. These chapters are fairly short. Any questions? Chapter 10. 11:1. Then I was given a reed like a measuring rod. And the angel stood, saying, rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. So a reed was a measuring pot, right? So it was a reed that was cut to a certain length, a standard length that they would use. Then they would take the reed and use it to measure things. So, and this vision of being given a reed is also is reminiscent of Ezekiel. Ezekiel, now this is interesting. So Ezekiel is prophesying during the Babylonian exile, right? So the people of Israel in the 6th century BC have been exiled to Babylon by the Babylonians, obviously. Not all the Jews, but especially the leadership, and Ezekiel was part of the priestly class, so he was taken into exile. And there he receives his call to be a prophet to the people in exile. And there in exile, while the first temple is destroyed, right? So the first temple is gone now. Solomon's temple is gone. There's no temple standing. And the people are, the majority of the people are in exile in Babylon. He gets this vision where he's handed a measuring rod, a reed, and he gets a vision of the second temple, of a new temple, right? So the measurements, and this, so he, and in the vision, he describes and measures, he gives the measurements of this new temple of God that he sees in a vision, that Ezekiel sees in a vision. The interesting thing here is that the descriptions in Ezekiel were never carried out. So when the people of Israel returned from exile, late in the 6th century BC, so around 520 BC, they started the process of building a second temple, but they didn't use the measurements that Ezekiel gave, right? So, and then fast forward 500 years to the time of Herod the Great. Herod the Great, who was alive when Jesus was born, he spent a lot of money making renovations to the temple and expanding the temple grounds in particular. And he didn't use the measurements from Ezekiel either, right? So these measurements were never used, so it was never meant to be taken literally, is the message. That this was simply a vision that a second temple would be constructed.
Did they know of Ezekiel's vision?
We would assume so, yeah. Yeah, but yeah, I don't know how we would know for sure, but yeah, he prophesied to the people in exile, so the people back in the land maybe wouldn't have known until the exiles returned. But yeah, we would assume that they knew about the vision, but it wasn't intended to, or it never informed them of what they actually did. The most famous part of Ezekiel's vision, of course, is read in our services, especially on the feasts of the most Holy Mother of God. So for the Vespers is when Old Testament readings are read. So Vespers for Dormition, Vespers for the Nativity of the Theotokos on September 8th. We always read this passage from Ezekiel, which talks about, do you guys remember? Anybody know which one we're?
Bones.
But no, not the vision of the bones, that's a good guess. It's about the east gate. The east gate, remember hearing this ever? So it's from Ezekiel, where he's describing this vision of the temple, and he says that the east gate of the temple shall remain closed, and only the prince shall enter in that gate. Only the prince. And this is his vision. And so we read that, we see that, the church sees that as being fulfilled in the Theotokos. This vision of the temple wasn't a literal temple to be built, but it was the plan of God. And the Theotokos, the Holy Mother, is the east. She is the one through whom the prince enters into the world, into his temple. And it remains forever closed, which is another reason why we say that she's the ever virgin Mary, because Ezekiel in his prophecy says that only the prince shall enter in by this gate, and it shall remain closed. So if we accept that this was a prophecy about the Virgin Mary, then it helps our argument that she was ever virgin. Alright, so I make this.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So the reference to the east gate is to the Virgin Mary's womb?
Yes.
Okay. I thought I
Yeah.
heard that. I just wanted to make sure. Sorry.
So I mentioned this about it not being a literal building, because if you look at, anybody familiar with the Schofield Bible? Schofield Bible is, Schofield was a dispensationalist, which is, anyways, it'll take us too far afield to get into what they believe, but they're pretty out there for us. And part of what they believe is they have a very literal reading of the Bible. So they say that the third temple that they're waiting to be built so that Jesus can come back, they say he can't come back until he's handcuffed. He can't come back until we humans build the third temple in Jerusalem. And that this third temple that's going to be built is going to be to the measurements that Ezekiel gave, right? But we don't accept that. Alright. So verse 11:2. Alright, because he's just been told, rise and measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. But it continues the order. But leave out the court which is outside the temple, and do not measure it. for it has been given to the Gentiles. So, you know, in the temple grounds, you had the Holy of Holies, you had the holy place, which is where the priests conducted, you know, most of their kind of business, which represents the altar for us now. You had the altar of incense in the holy place in front of the Holy of Holies. The priests spent most of their time in front of the altar of incense, just like we spend our time in front of the altar. The Holy of Holies being the tabernacle that's on the back of the altar where the body and blood of Christ is kept. And there were courts like emanating out from this holy place. So you had the court of the priests, which only the priests could enter. Then you had the court of the Israelites, which only the Israelite men could enter. And then you had the court of the Gentiles, which anybody could enter. So he's saying, leave out the court outside the temple, the court of the Gentiles was technically outside the temple proper because Gentiles couldn't enter into the temple. To the temple precincts. So he says, leave out the court of the Gentiles, for it has been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. Alright, 42 months is according to, so at this time, the calendar was 360 days, it wasn't 365 like we have now, it was 360 days. I say that because in a second, they're gonna say 1,260 days. That is 1,260 days is 42 months, which is what? 3.5 years. So it's 3 ways of measuring the same amount of time. Alright. So, and this is coming from Daniel. Daniel uses these numbers as well. And so they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months, for 3.5 years. And what does happen so in 70 AD, the Gentiles, the Romans, come in, destroy Jerusalem and destroy the temple. So it's probably referring to this. John is writing this around the year 95 or 96 AD. So in 25, 26 years earlier, in 70, the Romans had come and destroyed the temple and tread the holy city underfoot. Here it says they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. And we said that 3.5 years represents a finite amount of time. So in other words, they will come, they will bring destruction to Jerusalem, but it won't last forever. There will be a finite amount of time. And I will give power, he continues in verse 3, and I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, 3.5 years, clothed in sackcloth. Alright, so.
Those are the witnesses.
The witnesses, so who are the 2 witnesses? The 2 witnesses who will be clothed in sackcloth are probably Elijah and Moses. This is probably what what we're supposed to kind of bring to mind here is Elijah and Moses. Also, we could bring to mind Zechariah. In the prophet Zechariah, he talks about the two anointed, meaning the high priest was anointed and the king was anointed. So you have the 2 witnesses are this high priest figure and king figure, and or Elijah and Moses. Alright. And Elijah and Moses were both expected in the future. So if we're reading this like we should, as this kind of vision of the future, the Jews at the time expected Moses and Elijah to come back. That there would be a prophet like Moses. This was God promised that he would send a prophet like Moses in Deuteronomy. And so some people thought that Moses would come back. And this idea of Elijah coming back at the end of time, we see this in the Gospels even, right? Because they ask John the Baptist, they think that he might be Elijah who has come back before the end of time. They think that Jesus, remember Jesus asked, who do men say that I am? And they say Elijah, some say Elijah, because Elijah was supposed to come back before the end.
The Transfiguration, weren't they there?
Yeah, and Moses and Elijah were the 2 witnesses at the Transfiguration as well. So it's probably supposed to be that we're to keep in mind Moses and Elijah here.
Why was it disputed Enoch and Elijah?
Yeah, Enoch is another figure who, there's only one line about him in the canonical scriptures. It just says that, I think it says Enoch walked with God. Enoch was here no more and walked with God. In Genesis. And so there's a whole bunch of oral tradition and non-biblical literature about Enoch, because the Jews were always fascinated with this figure who kind of just disappeared and walked with God. And so he was considered one who never died. But anyway, that's not his view here, yeah, but he is a popular figure. Alright, right. Okay, verse, let's see, where was I? Oh, the two witnesses. Alright,
4.
yeah, verse 4, okay. These, the two witnesses, are the two olive trees and the two lampstands standing before the God of the earth. So here it points us back to Zechariah again, who had this, which Zechariah presents the image of two 7-branched, 7-candle lampstands and two olive trees, which again represented the two anointed ones, the king and the high priest. And if anyone wants to harm them, these two witnesses, fire proceeds from their mouth and devours their enemies. And if anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this manner. Alright, so this brings to mind Elijah, right? Because Elijah, remember, calls down fire from heaven on the confrontation on Mount Carmel in I think it's 1 Kings. Now you remember this famous scene where Jezebel has all these false prophets and Elijah challenges them to a duel basically, and they set up 2 altars, and the prophets of Baal unsuccessfully try for hours and hours to get God to send down fire from heaven to light the sacrifice and altar that they've the sacrifice on an altar they've made. Nothing happens, and Elijah tells them, pour water on the altar, pour more water on the altar. He prays, and then fire comes down and not only burns up the sacrifice, but burns up the whole stone altar as well. So Elijah is this figure who can bring down fire from heaven. So that's probably this fire, and here the fire proceeds from their mouth and they're prophesying, the judgment that they're bringing. So again, it's probably Elijah here. Alright, 6. These two witnesses have power to shut heaven so that no rain falls in the days of the prophecy. Who does that remind us of? Elijah again, right? Elijah's the one who shut up the heavens for, according to tradition, 3.5 years. He shut up the heavens and there was drought in Israel. And they, the two witnesses, have power over waters to turn them to blood and to strike the earth with all plagues. Who does that sound like? Moses, right? As often as they desire.
Why does it say if anyone wants to harm them, he must be killed in this manner?
Yeah.
Is that why they burn people at the stake?
I don't know about that. Yeah, I don't know why it says he must be killed in this manner, but the imagery is that this fire of their judgment, the prophecy will burn up their enemies, will bring now that the end is coming, God is going to be made manifest in an unmediated way. God is going to be fully present with humanity, and so there can no longer be any veils, and God's holiness brings with it blessings and judgment, right? Because that which is evil can't stand in the presence of God, it will be burned up. So this is probably the imagery of the fire and being killed, is that evil will be killed by the fire of God's immediate presence.
Father Gregory,
Yeah.
how long did it take John to
Right?
write all this
Yeah.
confusion?
So, yeah, I don't know.
You know.
It just says on chapter 1 that he was praying on a Sunday, so you get the idea that this happens in one day. But then he has, yeah. And then, have anybody here been to Patmos?
I have,
Did you go into the cave?
yeah.
Yeah, the cave where he received the revelation, and then there's that crack in the rocks where the revelation came through to him. Yeah.
But it's the.
Could Elijah also be an archetype,
Of
a group of people that will meet this?
oh,
Like, can it also
oh,
be a person, Elijah the person, but also an archetype?
for prophets in general? Yeah, perhaps, yeah. I didn't read that, but yeah, perhaps that just what prophets would come on earth. I mean, John is now being appointed a prophet, so Yeah, and they looked for someone who would be like Elijah, the second coming of Elijah, so yeah, it could be someone like Elijah in his power. Alright, verse 7. Alright, verse 7, when they finished their testimony, and testimony is a big thing in John in general. In John's gospel, which we've been reading in church the last few weeks, John's gospel. We see again and again the testimony of the Samaritan woman last week, right? She goes and testifies to her fellow Samaritans and they come to believe. The testimony of the blind man before this court hearing, before the Pharisees. Testimony is something John talks about again and again. This is kind of the main function of a true Christian, is to testify. And the word testify, martyria in Greek, also means martyr. Martyr, testify is the same word. So that by their deaths, which were usually these public deaths in front of great crowds, they were testifying to their belief, their unshakable belief in Christ. So when they finish this idea of testimony is very important. When they finish their testimony, and here it could be referring to what they have to say in prophecy, this fire that they're of judgment that they're breathing out in prophecy. When these two witnesses finish their testimony, the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit will make war against them, overcome them, and kill them. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom in Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. Alright, so this is kind of confusing imagery here. So, one, you have to say that throughout the ancient world, and probably a little bit, at least in our time, it's the kind of the greatest dishonor that you could do to someone was not bury them. Right, that was kind of the worst thing that someone could do, the most dishonoring thing you could do. The greatest cruelty that someone could offer to them. So in this way, this kind of dishonoring death is reminiscent of Christ's death, this dishonorable death. Paul in Galatians contrasts the earthly and the heavenly Jerusalem. So Revelation may be doing the same thing here by talking about the great city, Jerusalem, but which spiritually is Sodom and Egypt, these two terrible places, right? So he's comparing and contrasting the two sides of Jerusalem. So the Old Testament prophets often compared to Jerusalem or Israel with Sodom. So for example, Isaiah chapter 1, Jeremiah chapter 23. Egypt had oppressed Israel, and so Jerusalem's religious authorities, the Jewish authorities, had also oppressed the true followers of God, the Christians. Remember John's writing 95-96, already the Christians are experiencing persecution by the Jews. They're being kicked out of the synagogues, which we heard about in the gospel reading. The blind man gets kicked out of the synagogue. The parents were afraid of being kicked out of the synagogue. So there's this element of persecution going on here. So these two witnesses are persecuted by this beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit, makes war against them, and kills them. And the background for this is the city of Jerusalem, which spiritually has turned into Sodom, right? By persecuting these two great witnesses. So, which is by extension is by persecuting the Christians. The Christians had been run out of Jerusalem. Really, after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, a lot of the Jews blamed the Christians for any misfortune. They would blame somebody. And so a lot of times they would blame the Christians. It increased the persecution of the Christians. The Christians fled and left into the wilderness outside of Jerusalem. Alright, verse 9, 11:9. Then those from the peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations will see their dead bodies 3.5 days, and not allow their dead bodies to be put into graves. So 3.5 days may be mentioned to signify that the dead bodies of the two witnesses were decomposing, and it might also correspond to the 3.5 years of their prophesying. And those who dwell on the earth will rejoice over them, make merry, and send gifts to one another, because these two prophets tormented those who dwell on the earth. So through their word of judgment, the prophesying of judgment, they tormented the evil ones on earth. And so the people, the evil on earth now are rejoicing that these two prophets are dead. 11:11. Now after the 3.5 days, the breath of life from God entered them, and they stood on their feet, and great fear fell on those who saw them. So here we have an idea of Genesis 2:7, where God breathes life into man who he made out of the earth, and also Ezekiel 37, the dry bones, right? So you get this idea of this, it's a image of the resurrection. So God breathes life into these two corpses, presumably of Elijah and Moses. And paralleling now the resurrection. Alright, 11:12. And they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, "Come up here." And they ascended to heaven in a cloud, and their enemies saw them. So who else ascended into heaven on a cloud?
Christ.
Christ, but I'm thinking here Elijah, right? So again, this, yeah, in a chariot, right? Chariot.
Kids,
We have kids,
No
we
way.
have kids that work sanitizers.
Alright, so you get again this idea of Elijah, Elijah imagery. Alright, 13. In the same hour, there was a great earthquake, and 1/10 of the city fell. And the earthquake, 7,000 people were killed, and the rest were afraid and gave glory to the God of heaven. So here is probably, if the 1/10 of the city is the 7,000 people who were killed, that gives you a population of approximately 70,000, which would fit Jerusalem. Some people have speculated that it's talking, the city that it's talking about here is Rome, because later in Revelation, you can see that John turns his focus to Rome. But the population of Rome is estimated to be maybe 1 million people, so much more likely that it's Jerusalem.
No, the Russians thought this was happening to them when the communists took over. Some of the stuff, just
Yeah.
look outside.
Right, yeah, I bet that they saw,
I just wonder what they thought of reading this and then some of the stuff is happening to them.
yeah, especially the persecution, yeah. Alright. 11:14. The second woe is past. Behold, the third woe is coming quickly. So trumpets, the trumpet angels, number 5 and 6 were woes 1 and 2. So now the 7th trumpet angel, the 7th trumpet that is about to sound, this is the third woe that's coming quickly, and this is what he just told us is going to signify the end. The 7th trumpet means the end. So here it comes, 11:15. Then the 7th angel sounded, and there were loud voices in heaven saying, "The kingdoms of this world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever." Alright, so the world system in that day, in John's day, was Rome, right? And Rome was a kingdom, an empire. But it would be handed over to God's people according to Daniel 7. We also have this imagery of Israel's final king would have an eternal reign according to Isaiah, according to Daniel, 1 Maccabees. And then the idea of the trumpet blowing, the trumpets were always blown on the accession of a new Israelite king. So you get this image now with the 7th trumpet blowing, that a new king has arisen. It's Israel's final king who will have this eternal reign, who will have the kingdoms of the earth turned over to him, according to Daniel 7. And in fact, this is what happens when Constantine the Great accepts Christianity and the Roman Empire becomes Christian. The Roman Empire, which would have been unthinkable, the Roman Empire is handed over to Christ. Constantine, the imagery of Constantine is often of him handing over this globe to and offering it up to Christ. So it does in fact happen, this prophecy, that the kingdoms of the earth are given over to the Lord and his Messiah. Alright, 16. And the 24 elders, and I'll put a pin in that for a second, the 24 elders, we're gonna come back to 24 elders. And the 24 elders who sat before God on their thrones, remember this is from back in the vision of the throne room back in I think chapters 4 and 5, fell, these 24 elders or presbyters, which is the word we get priests from, priests, presbyters, elders, same thing. Who sat before God on their thrones, fell on their faces and worshiped God, saying, "We give you thanks, O Lord God Almighty, the one who is and who was and who is to come." This is a kind of famous line that we quote from Revelation often. Jesus is the one who is, who was, and who is to come, or who is coming. "Because you have taken your great power and reigned. The nations were angry, and your wrath has come, and the time of the dead, that they should be judged." In other words, the resurrection. "And that you should reward your servants, the prophets and the saints, and those who fear your name, small and great, and should destroy those who destroy the earth." Alright, so Judaism at this time recognized that God was not simply the God of Israel, but was the God of the whole world, God of the whole earth. But they also acknowledged that that wasn't manifest yet at this time, that God only at their time wasn't reigning over the whole earth visibly. Like the other nations weren't acknowledging God as their God and King. Only Israel was. But they expected this to happen in the future, that the nations would openly recognize Yahweh as the God of the whole earth. And usually in this kind of vision, Israel would rule over the nations on God's behalf. So, and this would happen at the end of the age, on the last day. So this is what he's seeing happening. This is it. This is the end. In the raging of the nations that it talked about God's wrath and the rule of Christ over the nations, the rule of the Messiah over the nations, finds echoes in Psalm 2. If you read Psalm 2, you'll see the same themes. Judaism held that the righteous were rewarded at the end of the age, and the destroyers of the earth, which it says in that last line, and God should destroy those who destroy the earth. Either it could mean a lot of things, but it could mean, for one, humanity's abuse of its stewardship over the earth, that God will destroy those who are destroying the earth, who are not exercising appropriately their stewardship of the earth. Or it could refer to the demons who had reigned on earth, but whose run is now over. So in any event, this is an image of the end, when all things will be judged by God. Alright, 11:19. Then the temple of God was opened in heaven. And so his temple exists also in his throne room in heaven. His throne room in heaven is also this temple. And so the temple of God in heaven was open, and the ark of his covenant was seen in his temple. Alright, so why is that important? So the ark of the covenant was hid in the Holy of Holies, right? That was the main object that was hid in the Holy of Holies, because it was God's throne. The Ark of the Covenant, the Ark was his throne, where he was pictured as kind of sitting on top of this throne in a position of judgment. And this was these arks were kind of typical for Near Eastern religions of the time, that their thrones for their gods all looked something like this ark. And so now that the Ark of the Covenant was seen in his temple, it's as if the curtain separating the Holy of Holies from the people has been taken away. And so this curtain between the Holy of Holies and the holy place represented this division between God and the people. That was, remember, at Christ, that curtain is ripped, so that now the priests who are serving at the altar of incense before the Holy of Holies, now they can see directly into the Holy of Holies, because that curtain has been ripped. There's still a curtain behind them separating the priests from the people, but this curtain has separated, this curtain has opened up between God, whoever the Holy of Holies, and the priests, the representatives of the people who are bringing their prayers before him.
Father,
Yeah,
why is this supposed to happen in the future, when I thought I had learned that, we all know that the temple ripped when Christ was killed, when he was crucified.
right. So this
And
is
so it's already been open to us.
right. So this is where it gets confusing. So it's not exactly, like I was saying at the beginning, it's not exactly a step-by-step book of what's going to happen chronologically at the end of time. You get a mixture of visions here, because just in a few verses, and actually the next verse almost, it's gonna talk about Christ being born, right, which obviously already happened as well. So it's not exactly a linear vision, right? It's kind of giving you glimpses from different perspectives of things that happened in the past and in the future. And the ripping of the curtain, Christ's crucifixion, and the ripping of the curtain is kind of an eschatological sign as well. I mean, it points toward the end of time, even though it happened within history. So yes, it's confusing. Yeah,
And I always see Revelation as an analogy, it's, infinite. But what I'm seeing now is also the curtain, that represents sin. And when Jesus was crucified, there came a break where you could,
yes. Yes, yeah, I think that you can see it that way because. You know, the Ark of the Covenant, if you remember, this was kind of a symbol of God's holiness, right? And holiness was and is a powerful thing. It's something that when the Ark of the Covenant was brought into Jerusalem, into the temple, remember David danced before it, right? And when the Ark of the Covenant was brought out, it led the people of Israel into battle. And in these cases, it was a good sign. It was a sign of rejoicing. It was a sign that God was with his people in battle. But then you also remember stories about the Ark of the Covenant when the Levites were carrying it and they stumbled and it looked like the Ark was gonna fall, and Uzzah reached out to who wasn't a Levite, tried to help them, you know, and he died because he touched the Ark of the Covenant, which he wasn't supposed to. He wasn't a Levite, he wasn't a priest, so he wasn't supposed to touch it. And he died, which is why incidentally we don't allow people to touch things on the altar. Even altar boys are not supposed to touch things on the altar because of this imagery of holiness in the Ark of the Covenant, that someone who's not a Levite, a priest or a deacon can't be touching holy things like that. Yeah, and so this idea that sin is what had separated people from being able to be in God's direct presence, right? Our sin made God in his mercy separated himself from us in our sin, because to be in his unmediated presence with our sin would burn us up, right? So now that sin has been destroyed, yeah, so you could see it that way, yeah. Alright, let's see. Then the temple was opened in heaven, and the ark of his covenant was seen in his temple, and there were lightnings, noises, thunderings, an earthquake, and great hail. So this is all kind of, you know, the tabernacle, which was the forerunner of the temple, before Solomon built the temple, they had a tabernacle, which was a mobile tabernacle, a mobile tent that they worshipped in. So the tabernacle and later the temple, which was just like the permanent structure for the tabernacle, they were both considered microcosms of the world. So in the temple, the ceiling was actually painted interestingly to look like the sky, which is why sometimes in Orthodox churches, you'll see the ceiling of the churches is painted blue, and sometimes even with stars. And actually our church used to be that way until, I don't know, maybe 30 years ago or something like that.
At the eighties.
It was blue with stars. And then I heard the reason that it was painted white was simply because they got a deal on. That's what I heard, that, yeah, you would know, yeah, they got a deal on if they painted it.
who painted it.
It was easier and cheaper, and so they painted it white, but there was no reason, there was no theological reason why they changed it from the original blue. In fact, it kind of makes sense that coming out of this temple image, that the church would look like the sky, because it wants to make the church or the temple seem like a microcosm of the whole world. So in the temple area, for example, fruit trees were planted in the temple area to kind of show this kind of paradise, and which is why traditionally the church, you know, we should care for the outside of the church, because when you enter into the church grounds, you're entering into paradise. And so there should be this imagery of paradise, you know, that's why often churches will have maybe a water fountain, or will have plants, flowers, etc. outside, because you're entering into this holy space. So the church, so in this vision that John is seeing here, of the temple of God opened in heaven, is coextensive with the whole world, right? So this is an image of the whole world. The Holy of Holies is now open for all to see, and that's when you get all this hail, earthquakes, etc. So now God is dwelling directly with his people, right? The earth and the temple are one thing. God is in the temple, God is in the earth. There's no longer a curtain separating them. So God is in this last judgment, God is with us in his unmediated presence. So there's nothing between us. So we have nothing to hide behind. Everything is going to be revealed. So, alright, so that's the end of chapter 11. Now, we can start chapter 12. Chapter 12 is when we get the image of Christ being born. So now a great sign appeared in heaven. A woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then, being with child, she cried out in labor and pain to give birth. Alright, so who is the woman? Yeah. Theotokos, most interpreters, there's kind of two schools of thought. One is that because she has this garland of 12 stars represent 12 tribes of Israel, and so that the woman represents Israel. But most interpreters see it as the Theotokos, and there's no reason it can't be both. Actually, we're gonna see some imagery from Israel, because Israel, the church is Israel, right? The church is the new renewed Israel, and the Theotokos is the mother of the church, right? So what is it, Saint Cyprian in 250 said, if you have God as your father, then if as a Christian you have God as your father, then you must have the Theotokos as your father. So all of us, she is the mother of the church. So it's this same image, yeah.
And I've also read in Jewish tradition within the scriptures, when a woman is mentioned, it also means the soul.
Means
Means
what?
The soul.
Your soul.
Interesting. Can see that. Alright, so this great sign appeared in heaven. Right, and another, verse 3, and another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 diadems, crowns on his head. Alright, so what's going on with this?
When I usually stop.
Yeah. Alright, so this imagery is coming to us from Daniel, partly, with each of the 7 heads has 10 horns. A horn represents power, so 10 horns represents a lot of power. So, and this imagery is coming from Daniel, right before the Son of Man is enthroned next to the Ancient of Days in Daniel. Daniel sees these beasts coming out, 4 beasts coming out of the sea, which represents the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, and then the Romans, which were the 4 successive empires that kind of oppressed Israel, took over Israel. Alright, so what this image of the dragon, and you see this a lot in iconography too, that the dragon and the serpent, kind of the imagery gets kind of mixed. And the same thing is here, John is going to equate the dragon and the serpent. So the serpent from Genesis, which is the evil one, he's going to kind of conflate that with this dragon figure, because they're both, what do you call them, lizards of some kind. So why though the dragon? So it's probably not coincidental that that this image of the dragon was throughout ancient mythology, throughout many cultures. So a common Greek myth that was spread in several forms, as the myths often are, presented Leto giving birth to the god Apollo while opposed by the dragon Python. Apollo then pursued the dragon Python and slew him. In an Egyptian story, the goddess Isis gave birth to the sun god Horus as the red dragon Typhon was pursuing her. Horus eventually killed Typhon. Additionally, ancient Mesopotamian myths portrayed 7-headed monsters. Later Jewish tradition linked the worship of dragons to Babylon. The image of a 7-headed serpent or dragon was also part of Canaanite mythology, the people who were in the land of Israel before Israel. Which the Israelites, as they often did, took Canaanite mythology and turned it to better purposes. So God parting the Red Sea was now symbolized as a defeat not only of Pharaoh, but of the primeval serpent Leviathan. Which was the Canaanite god. And remember, water, sea represents chaos, evil, disorder. And for all these ancient peoples. The Greek hero Hercules also confronted a seven-headed dragon, the Lernaean Hydra in Greek mythology. The Jewish people had many stories about the great evil reptile Leviathan, that he would even be killed and served up as part of the course at the Messianic banquet at the end of time. So here, of course, the dragon is identified with the serpent of Genesis 3 and the devil. So interestingly too, when you look at the icon of theophany at Jesus' baptism, a lot of times there is a serpent pictured that in the water that Jesus is kind of standing on top of. This is from this idea of taking over the Canaanite mythology, that there was this serpent Leviathan that dwelt in the water that represented evil, and that Jesus, by descending into the water, actually defeats Leviathan, right? Alright, so that's the dragon. The dragon is representing evil.
Do the diadems represent anything?
Yeah, I think they said that represents the crowns, meaning the kingdoms. These kingdoms like the Babylonians, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans.
I heard some long time ago, Protestants or whatever they were saying this is forecasting the end of time, so that Hitler gets a crown, Stalin gets one, or the Empire is doing.
Yeah.
And to kind of figure out, okay, then tomorrow. Because we've had all these empires, Alexander got one, I think.
Yeah. Alright, so it says the dragon in verse 4, his tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Now what have we been saying that the stars represent? Angels, right? So a third of the angels of heaven and threw them to earth. Now traditionally, you had the 70 or 72 in the scriptures. It's always, there's a confusion whether it's 70 or 72. But this number 70 or 72 comes up often. First, in Genesis, it comes up as the number of the nations, right? And the tradition was that God had assigned, God in his divine counsel with these angelic beings had 70 or 72 angels to one angel to each of the nations, right? And that all of these 72 were part of his divine counsel. Now, remember we put a pin in the 24 elders, right? So it says a third of the stars of heaven were thrown down to the earth. So the interpretation is that these are the fallen angels. A third of the 72 fell. Now, what's a third of 72? 24.
24.
So this idea of the 24 elders or presbyters or priests, 24 elders is the best translation, is that these are the saints, not just that there are only going to be 24 saints or only 24 people saved or something, but it represents this number of humans who are going to take the place of the fallen angels in the divine counsel of God. So the saints are the ones who replace these fallen angels in God's kind of administration of the world. And you see this, like for example, where I live in Thessaloniki. In Thessaloniki, before Christianity, the goddess, the patroness of Thessaloniki was Aphrodite, right? Now, in Jewish tradition and Christian tradition, they would consider not just a fake god, but actually a demon, right? St. Paul calls these gods of the pagans demons. So this was a fallen angel, in other words. So what happens when Christianity comes is that fallen angel Aphrodite is replaced by Saint Demetrius, right? So not just replaced in terms of, what Protestants accuse us of is, oh, well, they simply just turned the worship of pagan gods into the worship of saints. No, they literally replaced, Saint Demetrius literally replaced this fallen angel in God's divine counsel. And that's the imagery that's being used. So the idea of these saints being up in God's throne room, sitting on thrones themselves around God, means that they were constituting part of this divine council and they had taken the place of the fallen angels. Alright, we gotta wrap up here. So let's see, where can we stop? So through the third of the stars to the earth, and the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour her child as soon as it was born. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God in his throne. Alright, let's stop there, and I'll just say that the rod of iron is an image from Psalm 110 in Daniel, and it was a prediction of the Messiah's rule at the end of time, and that he would rule with a rod of iron. So this male child, the Christ child, obviously, was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, as the Messiah has predicted. And her child was caught up to God in the heavens in his throne. Then we'll start with 12:6 next week. All right,
Say what the crown represented,
which one?
the crown, the 10 crowns.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about. I didn't read anything about it. I mean, I would guess it had something to do with the kingdoms of the earth, you know, like Babylonians, the Greeks, or the Romans, but I didn't read it. I'll look All right, any other questions?
Thank you, Father Gregory.
Thank you.
We love you.
Love you
Thank
too.
you, Father.
Bye.
Bye.
Glad to know you.
We can't see you, but bye.
Bye.